You've heard the name Atlantis, right? A sunken city, a magical kingdom. Well, today, we're going to push all that aside. We're going to dive into a really compelling case built piece by piece for what might be a forgotten chapter of human history, a story that, honestly, might be way more real than you ever thought possible.
So let's just get right to it. The big question. Is Atlantis just a fairy tale that Plato made up? Or could it be a real, actual memory of our distant past, even if it's a little distorted? That's what we're going to dig into today.
And to answer that, we really have to look past the version we see in movies. We need to get to the core claim, the thing that started the whole legend. What if the story isn't about magic at all, but about a very, very real catastrophe?
Okay, let's stop here for a sec because this definition is absolutely crucial. We're not talking about some fantasy land. The argument is that Atlantis was a real, advanced civilization that was wiped out about 9,000 years before Plato's time. And here's the most important part. The memory of it wasn't just some random legend. It was deliberately saved and passed down.
And this idea of preservation, that's the whole key. The argument isn't just that some big event happened, but that a specific group of people made sure the memory of that event would survive for thousands and thousands of years. So you gotta ask, how on earth does a story survive for that long?
Well, the timeline is just mind-boggling. I mean, look at this. The collapse supposedly happens almost 11,000 years before Common Era. And get this, that lines up perfectly with the start of the Younger Dryas, a real-life climate event that suddenly threw the world back into Ice Age conditions and caused absolutely catastrophic global flooding. The memory is then kept alive in Egypt for millennia until the Greek lawmaker Solon hears it, and then finally Plato writes it all down. That's one heck of a journey for a single story.
And this is what makes it so wild. It wasn't just some vague, he said, she said kind of legend. The claim is that there was a specific, named chain of people who passed it down. You go from the Egyptian priests to Solon, who told his relative Dropadites, who told his son, Critias the Elder, who then told his grandson, Critias the Younger, who happened to be Plato's cousin and told him the story directly. See? This isn't presented as folklore, it's presented as a piece of family history.
Okay, so we have the claim, and we have the supposed path it took to get to us. Now for the really good stuff. Let's get to the evidence. We're going to walk through this like a detective, laying out the key exhibits that make this whole case so fascinating.
First up, Exhibit A. And honestly, this might be the single most startling piece of evidence in the whole account. The date. Plato doesn't just say a long time ago. No, he gives a number. And that number is unbelievably specific. Plato says the fall of Atlantis happened 9,000 years before his time. So why does that matter? Because 9,000 years before Plato puts you right around 9,600 BCE, the exact moment modern science tells us a global climate cataclysm, the Younger Dryas, was causing insane sea level rise and mass extinctions. The date is a direct hit. Now, to be fair, skeptics will say that Plato liked to use symbolic numbers, but for a guess, the precision here is just uncanny.
Okay, on to Exhibit B, where the story came from. Plato is super clear about this. He says it's not a Greek story at all. He says his ancestor Solon got it from priests in Egypt, a civilization that was, famously obsessed with history and preserving it.
So the idea is that Egyptian priests were the guardians of this ancient memory. And that's a big deal because, let's be honest, if any ancient culture on Earth could keep a story safe for 9,000 years, it was Egypt. They were the masters of long-term thinking. The counter-argument, of course, is that while some of their temple texts do talk about a primeval homeland destroyed by a flood, they don't use the specific name Atlantis.
And this is where the case just takes a totally fascinating turn. The story doesn't just exist in the old world. Something remarkably similar, with a name that's almost identical, shows up on the complete other side of the Atlantic Ocean.
Cultures like the Maya and the Aztec told stories about a drowned ancestral homeland way off to the east. And what do they call it? Atland. I mean, come on. For people who believe the story is real, a shared name for a shared catastrophe across a giant ocean is pretty powerful proof of a common ancient memory. Skeptics say similar myths can pop up independently, but the name, that is a very specific coincidence.
So let's just pull the camera back for a moment. The Atlantis story doesn't exist in a bubble. Once you start looking, you see these echoes of a massive catastrophe and a lost advanced civilization all over the ancient world.
You've got flood myths in basically every culture on the planet. You have pyramids popping up in Egypt, China, and the Americas. You've got mind-bendingly precise stonework in Peru and submerged ruins off the coasts of Japan and India. You could see all these weird anomalies as different pieces of the same puzzle, all pointing to a lost global maritime culture that was just wiped off the map. And all of this brings us to a really fundamental choice in how we look at these ancient stories. Are they just fiction, right? Made-up tales to teach a moral lesson? Or should we maybe consider the idea that a myth can be a form of compressed history? A garbled, distorted memory of a real traumatic event that was passed down through countless generations.
So, after looking at the date, the chain of transmission, the global echoes, what does it all add up to? Let's bring all these threads together and see where the evidence actually points.
Here's the bottom line. The case for Atlantis being probably true stands on these 4 pillars. It's not just one piece of evidence, but the fact that they all converge. You have a specific date that matches a real cataclysm, a custodian nation famous for preserving history, a story that's echoed across the globe, and a chain of transmission that's as clear as a family tree. When you put them all together, it makes for a pretty powerful argument.
And that leads us to the final challenge. If you want to argue that Atlantis is pure fiction, you have to explain away all of these coincidences. How did Plato, who knew nothing about Ice Age geology, just happen to pick the exact date of a real-world cataclysm? Why would he invent a whole backstory about Egypt preserving the memory? And what are the odds that a similar name for a similar myth ended up an entire ocean away?
When you weigh all of that evidence, the source for our explainer today lands on a really startling verdict. Not definitely true. Not certainly false, but probably true.
And that right there is the ultimate takeaway. The invitation here isn't to believe in some magical city with flying cars. It's to consider a different possibility, that Atlantis is simply the name we've given to the memory of a real, sophisticated, globally connected human civilization that was destroyed by climate change over 12,000 years ago, leaving behind only the faintest of echoes and fragmented myths.